Hello, welcome to Hope and Healing. My name is Jeff Friedman, and anyone who has been watching the show knows that we come on every week and are brought to you by Creative Tucson. And the show is about a variety of issues: mental health, emotional health, behavioral health, optimization of life. And each week we have a different guest who is usually a clinician, but someone with either great expertise or great interest in a particular area. And today we are happy to welcome back to Hope and Healing George Daranyi. He was on last week.
Thank you for having me back, Jeff.
Well, I'm really happy you were able to come back. Let me just tell you a little bit about George. He was born in Peru, of all places, and came to the United States as a child. Graduated from Hillsdale College in Michigan and the Southern Methodist University School of Law. He lives in Tucson now, where he practices law, does family interventions from time to time, and works with an organization called the Mankind Project. And that is what we are going to be talking about today. So, George, if you don't mind, could you bring viewers up to speed a little bit on what the Mankind Project is, a few of the more important points, just in case they missed the show last week?
So the Mankind Project was founded in 1985 in Milwaukee, and now there are men's trainings and men's groups all over the world. We just celebrated 32 years of doing that kind of work. And basically, the purpose behind the organization is to support men in their lives and to give them a sense of value and purpose for their lives. We call it missions of service. It's non-political, non-dogmatic, not-for-profit. We now have groups in 16 countries. We offer the trainings in 6 different languages, and there are about 65,000 men who've completed the training, the primary training, which is called the New Warrior Training Adventure. And there are about 20 to 25,000 men that sit regularly in men's circles somewhere in the world that are sponsored or loosely sponsored by the Mankind Project.
About how many members do you have here in Tucson?
We probably have about 200 men who are active or semi-active. We have about 100 men that I would say come and sit in a men's circle regularly every week somewhere in Tucson.
So what's the type of guy that tends to find appeal in the Mankind Project?
Typically, it's a middle-aged man, somewhere between the ages of 35 and 55, who is dissatisfied with some aspect of his life. There are things in his life that are working at some level, that are functioning, but there's something that he's noticed internally that is dissatisfying to him. And he wants something else. There's a missing or a longing for something. And he's looking and has probably been looking and tried lots of other modalities. Maybe he's been to therapy, maybe he's in recovery and going to 12-step meetings. Maybe he's in a crisis in his life and is having trouble navigating that. But there's something that's kind of shaken him, and he's looking for a place to land. And he's longing, he doesn't probably know it, but he's probably longing for connection with men in a way that can help him get through whatever that search is or that crisis or that event is. That's typically who shows up at one of our circles or at one of our trainings.
From your work in the Mankind Project, have you been able to get a sense of what is the genesis of that feeling of discontent or restlessness that might bring a man to call the Mankind Project?
You know, it's interesting that you ask that. I don't think it's one thing, but the way I've languaged it for the last few years, and this is based on my experience having worked now with thousands of men in these venues, I think the deepest longing that every man has is to be acknowledged and loved and accepted and blessed authentically for who he is and for the contribution that he has made in the world as a man.
Right.
And if that's missing for the man, and it is for most men,
Right.
then that creates this amazing discontent that then festers and can become other things like, you know, actual mental illness in some cases, addiction or acting out behavior. But I think that is the longing that every boy had when he was growing up, and then he becomes a man and it's still not there and he never got it. He doesn't know how to get it. He's longing for it. He's looking for it outside everywhere and he doesn't get it. And then something in him begins to get really unsettled. So, I mean, those aren't clinical terms,
Right.
but it's like the longing for the blessing and the acknowledgement of our father, if you will. Or it could be our mother or both.
Right.
But typically it's the longing for that I think brings a man into the work.
What are the barriers that tend to stand between a man and that acknowledgement in that respect and that connection?
Well, I think the first one is that men are taught from a very early age that you have to earn it, that you're not good enough the way you are. Unless you perform, unless you get good grades, unless you're a good boy, unless you please others, unless you do it my way. There are a whole string of unlesses that are built into the conversation that is occurring in a boy's head when he's growing up. And so what he interprets all of that, including trauma and all the things we covered last time, he interprets that at some level like there's something wrong with me. And I will never measure up. I will never be good enough. And therefore I am flawed or broken or undeserving or unworthy of the blessing that I'm longing for.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be the father or mother.
Correct.
It can be a teacher,
Correct.
an older brother or sister. Later in life, military superiors, college professors.
Exactly. You know, I know for myself that little boy that I was talking about, that was me.
Yeah.
You know, my dad was gone a lot when I was a boy, and I really missed him. And what I wanted was my dad in my life. Now, the great thing about my life today is he's in my life today. He's 88. He's alive. I'm connected to him. I have a deep and powerful and meaningful relationship with him. I know he loves me and blesses me unconditionally. So, you know, the outcome for me was really positive in real time.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true for most men, and I get that. But what I've learned is that men can have that. They can have that kind of a blessing. They can find it, discover it, and claim it without their actual real-life fathers doing it for them.
Mm-hmm.
There are other ways to do it. The Mankind Project is one way to get that.
So, George, can you describe the process of how a man gets from being that frustrated, restless, kind of emotionally shut down, wounded guy to someone who feels more integrated with his community, especially with other men, and valued and accepted?
I think the way that it has been done archetypically and mythopoetically and in real time is that men have to go through some kind of an initiatory process. You know, the tribesmen and women in Africa had that figured out a couple thousand years ago. We had to reinvent it.
When you said that, I thought to myself, that sounds a little bit scary.
There is an element of edginess to it and scariness to it. I think it requires, to use Joseph Campbell's language, it requires a man to go through a heroic journey, which has some really defined components, like an awakening, a calling into adventure, mm-hmm. and then the crisis that drops him or descends him into a new unfamiliar territory. And once he lands there, then he has to deal with something that he has not been willing to deal with in his life. There is a test or a challenge or a deep transformational experience that he has to walk through emotionally, maybe spiritually, maybe physically, that gets him from where he's been to a place that he's never been to before. That can be dangerous and difficult and scary, but I know that if a man can get through it, and most men do, what's on the other side is himself.
Right.
Reclaimed, integrated, authentic himself on his terms. So I think that's what it takes for most men. And most men do it unconsciously, by the way. The work we do is we bring it into consciousness. We create the actual experience of that for a man so he has it.
George, how do you create an environment in which a man is willing to face that danger, willing to take those risks, and willing to be as vulnerable as it sounds like this process requires?
Well, you have to create a container that can hold all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've done is we always have at least one staff man for every man going through, at
Right.
least one. It also requires some trained, skilled professionals to run the training. So every weekend that we put on anywhere in the world has what we call certified leaders and co-leaders. And these are men who've gone through extensive training, have staffed many, many other weekends.
And you're a certified
I'm a
leader.
certified leader. I'm currently on sabbatical, but there are many, many men around the world who are equally skilled as I am in doing the work. It requires a level of trust. The man who comes in has to, at some level, accept that he's going to be placed into the hands and into the care of men that he doesn't know,
Yeah.
and he's going to trust that they're going to hold him in a good way. And it requires a connection. It requires a conversation. Look, no man just arrives on a weekend. He's talked to, he's invited, he's interviewed. There's an assessment process that we engage in because we want to screen every person who's on the weekend to make sure that the experience is appropriate for them. So we've created some safety protocols about that. Look, men's work isn't safe work in the way that the world interprets safety. It's risky. And so there is something that is required of the man to accept as risky in order for him to step into the adventure.
Do you mean emotionally risky?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
emotionally, it's going to require him to be vulnerable at some
Right.
level. Now, physical safety, we try to do a really
Right.
good job of that. Look, there's things that happen all the time. Men are going to get dirty, and there might be some bumping into other men kinds of things.
Yeah.
But for the most part, physically, it's a very safe environment.
Well, as you were saying that, I thought to myself, I know some men who would sooner run through a machine gun fire than show that emotional vulnerability.
Yeah, the show
It can be the harder thing.
But I think it's harder for a man to admit and to deal with a broken heart than it
Yeah.
is to deal with a broken life. We are much better suited at handling the things outside of us than we are suited to handling the things inside of us. We haven't been taught. Now we can be.
So it's at a personal level. The work is also at a group level.
Yes.
Is there any macro component to
Yes.
the Mankind Project?
We are committed. We have some core values. One of them is we're committed to multiculturalism and multicultural training for our leaders and our senior staff.
Right.
So we discovered years ago that most of us were white men dealing with white men's issues and living inside of unearned white privilege, which, by the way, I had no idea about until I began doing my own work
Right.
about that. Because we're now in other countries and other cultures and other languages, we have to learn way more than we thought we did about all of that. Although it was founded in the United States, we constantly address our Americanism, our way of being as United States men.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we have to take that on, so we're doing that work. The other piece we're doing and beginning to do more of is we're looking at how we relate to the feminine. We've been doing men's work for 32 years,
Right.
and now we realize that we've missed half the equation, that inside of every man is a feminine component. There's part of the male psyche that is feminine in nature that we have to deal with. By the way, I resisted doing my work around the feminine for a long time. I'm still just a beginner there. I got a lot to learn. So those are the bigger pieces that are beginning to emerge. We don't have an institutional stance on things like politics, but we're committed to nonviolence as a foundational principle. We're committed to generosity. We're committed to integrity, accountability. So wherever that shows up, those aren't just individual and group processes. That means the institution has to do that work, and it also means we're bumping into other institutions all the time. And then we land inside of a culture. So our work is multifaceted.
Well, you know what I heard in that also is that the Mankind Project is focused more on walking than on talking.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is, and I think that what I heard was, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding, is that a person becomes more spiritual by behaving more spiritually. A person becomes more spiritual by living his life by spiritual principles.
That's right. One of the things I say a lot, and this comes out of my recovery, is you cannot think your way or aware your way or intellect your way or cognitive your way into recovery.
Yeah.
You cannot do that.
Right.
The only way in is through some action, some
Right.
profound transformational thing that I'm doing in motion.
Yes.
And it's the same thing with any transformational experience. You cannot think your way into a heroic journey. You have to experience it. You have to do it.
And I would add to that it's going to cost you something.
Yeah, it comes at a price.
And there will be discomfort involved in that process if it is real.
Yeah. The paradox of what I just said is that you can think your way into relapse, and you can think your way back into asleepness. You can't think your way out of that,
Right.
but you can think your way back in it.
So where an alcoholic would relapse by drinking, what would relapse look like for someone who is involved in the Mankind Project?
I would see that as a man who goes numb, a man who abandons his core principles and values,
Right.
a man who is no longer willing to be a contribution to others, who has a mission of service and isn't active in it.
Right.
Those are acts of going back to sleep, if you will, that I see with men.
You know, in the last 6 months, I've lost 3 very close friends. And a woman who I'm very close to lost her son in August, and her younger son is now battling cancer. And so it's been a kind of a tough 6 months. And that's the piece that I noticed, is there is a great amount of energy kind of pulling me in the direction of numbness. And I have to be conscious, and I have to be mindful about this, and I have to put energy into my practice more now because of what's going on. And you know, I can see where someone who maybe is not that far along in the Mankind Project, and they're doing good work, and then they suffer a very significant loss. And it's a little bit more than they're prepared to.
Yeah, and there's a distinction between you know, having grief and loss and recovering from that and going quiet around that, and withdrawing to heal, withdrawing consciously to take care of yourself. By the way, those are acts of recovery. Those are acts of deep empowerment if they're done consciously. And so we have to distinguish between our normal responses to life's events, which include trauma, which include loss, which includes death, and our unhealthy responses to those things. And it's how we respond to the world that really determines what the quality of our conscious experience and existence is. So I don't want to be a real harsh critic here about anybody's process, because there's nothing wrong with any of it. The question is, who does a man want to be inside of whatever experience he's having? Does he want to be fully engaged and present for himself and the experience and others, or is he going to check out and go numb? You know?
Does the Mankind Project bear any responsibility when one of their members is going through a really hard life experience?
We don't see it as a responsibility, but we see it as a regular part of our connection to men.
I see.
You know, if a man's showing up at a meeting on a regular basis and then he's not showing up,
Yeah.
we make a phone call. Like, what's up?
That's what I meant.
Yeah,
That's
like what?
something that is pretty common in AA
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
And here's the other thing, you know, I used to wonder as a boy, like who my real friends would be when I was older. And one of the things that happened to me was before I went to the first New Warrior training, I met a therapist, and he said something to me that was absolutely profound. He said, once I started doing men's work, I knew who the men were going to be that would be at my funeral, who would carry me across the river, and who would take care of my wife and family if I couldn't. He said, I never knew who those men were going to be until now. And that landed in me like a shot, like boom. You know what? I want a life like that. And today, I have dozens of those men in my life who have taken a stand for me, who are there when I need them,
Right.
who are willing to go to bat for me, who have my back, and who I know will carry me across the river and take care of my wife and family.
Is that pretty typical for someone who's in the Mankind Project?
Yeah, those
they
men,
could say
men
the
who
same
stay
thing.
involved and are really committed to it,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is not unusual.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a band of brothers, if you will, real brothers.
You talked a little bit about our feminine side, but as you led into that, you talked a little bit about relating to women. And can you talk a little bit about how that is addressed, our relationships with women?
One of the criticisms that MKP, the Mankind Project, has gotten over the years is, hey, you men are so focused on men. Like, why
Right.
men? Like, what
Yeah.
about women? What about children, right? And what about our villages and our churches and our communities? So we get that. But here's the way we get there. We know that if we don't have healthy, authentic, inspiring, present, committed men
Right.
in the world, everybody suffers, not just
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
But that lands everywhere, especially in a culture and a nation that is still as patriarchal as this one is. So one of the things we deal with is our patriotism, our patriarchalism. I almost said patriotism, maybe that's for another show. But our embedded patriarchy and how our abuse of power in the past has landed on women and children. So that's one piece. So we know that as we build better men, we will have better relationships with women, and we will have better relationships with children. We will have better families, however family is defined. We will have better communities. We will have better spiritual organizations. Our governments will be better.
Can you be a little more specific about that? Better in what way? If I did significant work with the Mankind Project, how might my relationship change with significant women in my life?
Well, the first thing they would notice about you is that you are now emotionally literate, or more literate than you were before. That you would have access to your vulnerability as a man. That you could speak to and relate to women at a level that they're more comfortable with than we are as men. They would notice that about you instantly. So they would get access to you in a different way than in the past. By the way, I know you've done some of that work outside of MKP, but I'm using you as the example for the prototypical male that comes into our circles. The other thing that they would notice about you is that you would be committed to living a life on purpose and that has a purpose in it. And so they would really get, like, what's Jeff really about now? What's he committed to? What's he doing in the world that's making a difference? They would see that, and they would begin to trust that. And they would maybe align themselves with you and become an ally with you in that. So those two pieces alone would transform every relationship between a man and a woman. By the way, I'm a father. I've got 2 daughters. The way I relate to my children is very, very different now than it would have been if I had not done any of my own work.
Right.
They would still be getting the old version of me, the unawake version, the old institutional and cultural version, the one that was handed to me as a boy in South America, instead of the one I grew into as a result of doing all of my work.
Is the work still in progress for you?
Yeah, definitely. I have a mentor. One of the things I'm working on for myself is the fact that next year I'm going to be 60 years old. And that's the beginning of what we call eldership in MKP. And I have been resisting my growth into eldership for a long time. And behind that is the work I'm doing about the plain fact that everybody is heading for the grave.
Right.
And my resistance to really looking at the fact that my life will end one day. And what am I doing about that now? What am I confronting in myself? What is the legacy that I'm leaving? What do I want to say in the remaining days and weeks and months and years that I have? So for that, I need coaching, because I don't have the answers to those things. So I remain coachable and teachable. I still show up in men's circles, and I go for myself, not to facilitate, but just for me. I'm in therapy a lot, currently not, thank you very much, but I've been in and out of therapy for 25 years because I don't have the answers, and I need them for myself.
You know, that's something that I've given a lot of thought to too. I'm about 10 years ahead of you. My next birthday, I'll be 70. And so I find myself thinking about, because I'm not in that phase of life where I have to earn a living anymore. I'm retired, I have money, I have a part-time gig that I told you about before that's very gratifying, and then I work on this TV show. But I think what my mind has turned to is a few things. One is that I want to leave something behind of value, and one of the ways that I can do that is by teaching other people some of the things that I have learned in my life and in my professional training and career. And then the other thing that I've noticed, and I don't really know how much sense this makes, is that I want to go out leaving very light footprints from here on out.
Yes, I get that.
And I feel like there's nobody left that I have to impress. There are people in my life that I value so much, and my focus on them is how can I support them, how can I help them to grow spiritually and emotionally as best they can. And again, it goes back to an environment of safety.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't want to stomp around here. I don't want to yell at anybody anymore.
Yeah.
There's nobody I want to beat up. There's nobody I want to dress down. So I think that can be an interesting conversation for another day.
Yeah, I think what we've learned is that the final battle is internal.
Yes, exactly.
That's what you're saying.
And the final victory is extremely rewarding.
Yeah.
So, George, I want to thank you again for being a guest on the show.
Yeah, it's been
2 weeks in a row. It's wonderful. And I still have the feeling that we may not be totally finished with our discussion. So I want to invite you back another time when you can come.
I'm happy to come back anytime.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome. And thank you for watching Hope and Healing. We'll see you again next week.